Hello everyone, and welcome to the Mission Making the Safe Way tutorial video series. This is part 1. It'll cover pretty much the basics, the minimal amount that you might need to get your mission ready for our server, up and running using all of the components of our template, which are stored on our Dropbox that, well, I guess anybody watching this video should have access to. So the way I'm going to roll this is what I'm going to do is I will explain all of the components of our template that's currently set up on Dropbox, just so that you guys have a brief rundown of what everything does. Even if it's only sort of a surface level overview, it should be enough to get you started though. So I'm going to jump right into that. Let's get to our template. So here we have our template file. This will be the template file that you can find on Dropbox. For the purpose of this tutorial, I'm going to be making all of my changes on this template so that you guys can essentially have a solid, tangible reference to everything that I'm going to explain here. So what I will do is, I don't know, let's go alphabetically. I'll start up with ACE settings as part of the template. So on the top here we have these three .hpp files. As you can see here, it's referred to as a C++ header file, but essentially what we use it for is to incorporate ACE settings into our missions by means of segregating them from the main description.ext, which I'll explain later. But essentially what the description.ext handles is pretty much all surface level mission stuff: how many players are allowed per mission, what the mission name is, who the author is, stuff like that. It's all handled in the description.ext. And when we declare ACE settings, one way would be to come to the editor here, find yourself some systems. It's F5 on the quick access tab, and then under ACE. These are all of the ACE user settings that you have access to. Down here we've got our ACE medical, so your basic ACE medical settings here, like medics only and locations for epinephrine, stuff like that, right? So that is controlled by a thing called a module. However, sometimes copying modules from mission to mission to mission gets a little bit tiresome, and because of this we've created these .hpp files that essentially have all of this stuff here that you can see as part of the modules, except they're incorporated into this code. I'll show you here. So that base medical setting will be here somewhere under ACE medical. So here is enable overdosing, pain coefficient, enable airway, all that stuff, right? So some of these things are advanced ACE medical features, but we just generally use the basic setting, and all of those module settings are controlled from here. So that explains the default ACE settings. The ACE no weather is something that we've utilized on occasion. Essentially, when you want to set custom weather in your missions by mean of the weather settings over here. If you don't use that ACE no weather.hpp and use the ACE normal.hpp, what happens is it overwrites your basic your weather settings, the stuff that you set up, and replaces it with I believe propagation based on the climate of the area, something that they've put together, the ACE team. So I mean, most of the time it's going to be okay, but say you want it to be a dark and stormy night or something, you're going to want to use the ACE no weather.hpp to have that, you know, not happen. And then below our ACE settings we have a couple of custom functions that I've put together. The top one, ACE handle health, what it does is it fixes the blood glitch that we have so often. The ACE wound punishment, this is what we put together to limit player movement and stop them from sprinting and screw up their aim and stuff after they've been downed, as a form of punishment for getting shot, because we don't have instant kill or a generally streamlined respawn system. So we prefer the guys not to respawn, heal them on the battlefield, but because they've been shot and because we don't want them to get shot as often, we need to teach them not to get shot, and to do so we're going to punish them for getting shot. Cool, so that should cover the basic ACE settings. Over here you see this Dynaspawn. It's that function or set of functions that are put together for spawning AI. I'm not going to go into depth on that now. I'll explain it as part of one of the later tutorials, the mission or the AI spawn scripting tutorials. So we'll come back to this later, but all you need to know is that this is available on Dropbox as part of the mission template. Over here is a garrison script, and essentially what this is it's Ares's garrison script, but for single player debug and mission making purposes we can't run Ares because of the dependency it makes, and because we can't do that, I can't access the function directly from Ares. So what I do, or what I've done rather, is I've pulled the function out of Ares, or Ares Achilles as we're using now, and I've just put it straight in our mission file and declared it in the description.ext so that we can use the Ares function even when Ares is not running on that client or on the server. And essentially what this does is it just garrisons AI into houses around an area. And I'll explain how this works in one of our in the AI spawning mission tutorial that's coming later. Down here is just our images folder. Essentially what I like to do, you don't have to do it because you can sort of just slam everything around here, but what I like to do is I like to categorize each thing by folder and separate everything into its own separate folder so that your base mission file is not essentially cluttered, and so that everything's sort of in a neat place, a place you can access it easily. So what I've done is I've put our onload image, the image that gets displayed on your screen when you load into the mission, this one. I've put this here under the images folder, and then I've just declared it correctly in the description.ext so that it actually loads the image. Over here is a loadouts folder. Inside this loadouts folder we have a core.sqf, and what this is what I like to use it for. You don't have to use it this way, but what I like to use it for is essentially handling player spawns or player loadouts on their spawn and their respawn. And what you can do is you make each loadout its own .sqf or script file, and what you do is you use this core section to create logic for what kind of player it is and what loadout he should have, and then you call that through here, and essentially that'll allow you to keep everything nice and neat, so you don't have a ton of if statements declaring each sort of section of loadout. Instead you have a bunch of separate files that get called from inside a handler, which is the core.sqf that we have here. I will explain that also, or I'll explain loadouts just in general in a later tutorial. For now, I just want to make sure that you know the absolute minimum that you can put together to get into, or to create a mission that you can put on the server that'll just work. So, coming out of loadouts now, we have scripts, and what I've done is I've essentially removed all of my toolbox scripts and stuff that I use often because I think it's sort of clutter and not everybody would use them. But what I have left behind is this diagnostic script, which is a persistence performance check. And what this does is it queries the server over and over and over again while the mission's running, and just essentially logs the server performance, how many players are on, how many AI are on, how the server is doing in terms of performance. You don't have to run it, but if you want to run it, you know, to debug your mission or whatever, you just drop this in the init server, the init server.sqf, which is down below, and I'll explain that shortly. Okay, so we've covered all of our subfolders, and we move on to the description.ext. And essentially what this is it handles Bohemia interactive settings, as well as who the author is of the mission, what the mission name is and stuff, just on the surface level, not in folder or scripting based. It's just sort of like what's plain to see, what's easy to come across. So what I did is I copied this description.ext directly from my Operation King's Connection mission, which we played recently. So what that does is it gives us just an opportunity to explain exactly how to set your mission name and to set the briefing and stuff. So down here is the author for the mission. That's me. You can, get rid of whatever's in here, and I don't know, say your name is George. There we go. Your author is now George, and that'll display on the load screen when you load into the mission. So what we've got down here is the onload name. Again, same concept. When you load into the mission, there's a name displayed on the screen, and for whatever the mission name is, you just type it in here. So I'm going to call it mission template. And on load mission, this is a little brief description that goes underneath the image on your load screen, and you can use it to give a brief overview of the mission if you want. You can leave it blank if you want. So I'm just going to say this is a mission template. Cool. Over here is the overview picture, which I explained earlier in our images folder. So essentially, this section is a folder. This signifies that you're going into the folder, and then here's the image, right? So it's the same as on your Windows Explorer. See, Windows has gone and made it look nice here, but if you just click there, it shows you that it's using slashes to determine what's a folder, and then over here you can see that this isn't a folder. This is actually, or rather, this is the folder that we're inside. There's no slashes inside. So over here we've got our mission header. So the game type, basically we'll always use co-op. I guess in some circumstances you might use PvP or something similar. I don't believe it's actually called PvP in this game type, and you can leave it co-op if you really want to. It's not going to make a huge difference. It's just what gets displayed on the mission type up top in the load screen. So what we can do here is we can actually change this max players to 4 for the sake of this little template tutorial. And min players is essentially just how many players do you need to actually start the mission. In all of our cases we'll just use 1, but say, I don't know, say you have a minimum player requirement. It's like you want 2 people to be able to actually start the mission, you can change it to 2, but I wouldn't go playing around with that stuff. Rather just leave it as basic. Over here is just a little example of config identities. Here we have Barame Marimba. You guys will remember him from Operation King Snatcher. This section isn't completely necessary, but you can use it to declare, I don't know, any story-based characters you may have present in your mission. But for the sake of this template, I'm just gonna yank it. Okay, what we have down here is our config functions. And essentially what this is this allows you to configure any function that you may use in your mission. Here, for example, Dynaspawn, you can see that all functions are prefixed with the letters fn underscore. So you can see if I want it to be declared as a function, it's fn underscore and then arraygen, as you see here. It's in the folder as fn underscore arraygen and so on and so forth. So if you were to make a function for your mission, this is where you come and declare it. And then right at the bottom here we have a settings. And I explained them briefly earlier, but you see here it says hashtag include a settings noweather.hpp. It's just our way of making sure that they're not in the same folder. It just segregates the ACE settings out. It also means that ACE doesn't create a dependency on your mission, which is quite useful for if you want to test without ACE for whatever reason. Cool. So that is essentially the description.exe, except there's one more thing I'd like to cover. Over here is our respawn. And essentially what guys often forget, and what I forget occasionally actually, is that when respawn is set in the Bohemia Interactive respawn section, what you need to do, if you have it set to 3, and 3 and base are the same thing as you can see over here, is you need to place a marker for the faction that you want to respawn, right? So when you want whatever your unit is, so let's just plot down our basic fire fire team for NATO, right? If you want these guys to respawn, and you want the respawn to work properly, what you need is a marker that's called respawn_west. And now what that signifies is the area in which you're going to respawn when this respawn value is set to 3. I believe there's a couple others. One, if I recall correctly, respawns you on the spot that you died, which is obviously not, yeah, it's not something you want really, unless you're on your player respawn or whatever, you turn them into a camera, like for a spectator script, or for example, something like that. That would be if you were using permanent death as part of your missions. Anyway, so you'll notice that I used a system marker here that's called empty, and this marker essentially it can't be seen in game. So if I were to run the mission, which I'm not going to now, but if I were to, and I open my map, I wouldn't be able to see this marker. And these markers you'll find are incredibly useful for a whole variety of things, from unit spawns to markers for where artillery should land, and pretty much anything you can think of where you need a location. These markers are incredibly useful for that function. So, say you weren't using blue 4. There are, if you were using up 4, for example, if you were using red team, as you see over here, Mr. up 4, your respawn would no longer be respawn west. It would be respawn east, because that is the code word for the up 4 faction, west and east, i.e., you know, Western powers and Eastern powers. Additionally, there's respawn civilian and respawn GUR, as G-E-U-R or G-U-E-R, as respawn guerrilla, essentially, and guerrilla signifies the independent faction, the green faction. If you're ever having trouble with this, or you wanna make a new faction, or you're not sure about something, the best place to go is to the Bohemia Interactive Wiki. And generally, the fastest way to get there is to just Google Arma 3 in combination with whatever you're looking for. So in our case, it's respawn. So Arma 3 respawn, boom. First thing that's on the search list is a community BIS Studio wiki on Arma 3 respawn. So you open it up, and essentially it just explains everything that we've got in our description.ext here. We've got a bunch of separate parameters and pretty much everything you can get your hands on, and then over here we have the markers for player respawn. So you see I use respawn west, and I explain the concept of respawn east, and then there's respawn guerrilla and respawn civilian for the other respawn sides. There you go. Okay, so what I was explaining earlier, so the respawn, if you've got the number 1, it's you respawn as a seagull, as explained on the website here. Respawn 0, it shows the death screen. Respawn 2, you respawn on the spot where you died. Respawn 3 is base, that's the one we're going to use most often. Respawn group is it shifts you to the next available playable unit in the group that you're a part of. This is good for sort of smaller scale cooperative missions where there will be AI in the player group. We never really utilize that, but there's a lot of good cooperative missions on the workshop and put out by Bohemia where that is a function. And then 5 is essentially the same thing as 4, except it goes to the next playable unit on the same side, never mind in the same group. Cool, so that covers our description.ext in, I don't know, painful detail. You guys can come ask me about this if you don't quite understand as part of the video, but it's fairly straightforward, and the template is nice enough to have a bunch of comments explaining what each of these lines do as part of the description.ext. I hope I just covered pretty much everything that'll get you started. So after our description.ext, we have our init, and essentially The init is initialization, and essentially what that means is when the mission starts and you join, your client and the server gets initialized. And essentially what the init.sqf is it's lines of code to run once that initialization happens. So in our base init, the init that we want everybody to get declared on, we set the task force no auto long range radio variable to true, so that it doesn't force spawn you with a long range radio backpack, and we disable the saving for the mission, because it's a server-based cooperative mission, and saving causes problems with SQF functions, as you can see over here. Init player local is essentially so if init was a global init player local is an init specifically for players. So over here you can see this section over here is pretty much everything ACE related. The functions I explained, the blood fix and the wound punishment, you can see they're declared here. And what those functions use are these variables. These I guess they're sort of global variables, but not really. These variables are local to the player. And I declare these variables here in the init player local so that they're set properly here. And when these are running, it allows certain sections of the script inside these functions, or the script inside these functions to run. Without these variables, these functions don't work. And it's for good reason, because if for whatever reason one of these functions was to break down, I hope it never happens, but if they were, you could set these variables on every player to false as a form of debug to stop these functions from working. And essentially what it is a failsafe, and it's the same as dependent on your scripting knowledge. If you have a while loop that's set to while true, that it essentially means that the while loop will just run forever. But if something inside the while loop breaks, it's just going to keep repeating that broken piece of code over and over and over and over and over again, because there's no way to stop it. So what these essentially are ways to stop that from running. And down below that here we have the mission specific scripts, and that's essentially, this is the loadout core, that essentially the loadout handler that I explained earlier. And what you would do here with the init player local is, if you want a player, something to run only for a player, say you have an add action script, something that adds a scrollable menu action to an object in game, and you wanted to utilize that add action, you can't execute it on the server, because if you execute it on the server, only the server uses the add action, and the server can't use an add action, so that doesn't help you all that much. So you would execute it on the init player local. Pretty much anything else that requires only the player, so animations, or so say you want a beginning animation of player when you join the server, you want your guy to stand up from being injured or whatever, you would play that animation here in a player local. Next on our list we have our init server, and it's essentially, so if init player local is something only for the players to initialize, init server is script only for the server to initialize. So say you wanted to fill a bunch of ammo boxes with ammunition, you'd call it on the init server and use add magazine cargo global, because then the server will handle the spawning or the creation of those ammo boxes and putting ammo inside, etc., etc. There's a little bit more nuance to some of these things, and I'd like to explain it now, but I don't think I can put it into words. I'd actually have to show you. So possibly as I go through this tutorial, I'll explain, or I'll be able to show you how each of these works in a more in-depth manner as I'm expanding this tutorial. And the final thing on our list, our on-player respawn. This is essentially, it's essentially init player local, except the difference is that it runs only once the player is respawned. So when the player joins the server, they run init player local. When the player respawns, they run on player respawn. Luckily, these .sqfs are essentially, I don't know, they're named exactly what they do, which is beautiful. So it makes things easy to remember, easy to to just look at it and see what's happening there. So for this first tutorial's purposes, these things are identical. In some cases they might change, in other cases they'll be identical yet again. So it just depends on what scripts or what you're running for the mission. Cool, so now that we've covered that bit, and pretty much everything that there is to cover for the basics of our template, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put together a tiny little scenario. Just drop a bunch of, I guess, AI in this area. So we'll drop an enemy fire team. Let's go drop in the building quick. Cool, and I'm just gonna give a little bit of an initialization to this guy. And I guess I'll explain this because it might be interesting to some of you guys. So what I'm doing here is I am disabling AI path, which essentially stops them from moving, but will allow them to turn around, you know, stay in the same place. And I am setting their stance to standing. And what I'm doing is, instead of applying this to each individual unit, I am applying it to the group leader and telling him that every unit in the group must do that. So disable the path of X is a little magic variable used for each, and set the unit position up again, and then for each units group this. So all units inside this group, or and this being this little team leader unit here. Cool, and then what you would do is you would make sure that all of these guys over here, you would make sure that all of them are playable. And that's important because if they're not playable, then people can't actually use the slots that are available there. And for example, or rather, so in the server lobby when you join, sometimes you'll see some of the guys use custom role names so that it's easy to remember what the role is. And to change that, you just go into this unit and see under role description, you can call this guy blah blah, and in the server lobby, his role will be called blah blah. I'm not going to actually do that because that's silly, but it's just the purest form of example. Okay, so the last thing to cover is our headless client, which is sort of a new addition to our family of modules. So with the headless client, we've got a couple things that we need to add. For one, there's a couple of ACE-X settings which are not yet part of our acesettings.hpp that I explained earlier. So what you would do is you'd add the headless client, you'd enable the headless client as part of ACE-X, you'd put the end mission as part of this headless running as delayed 60 seconds, and for now let's just enable logging at some, actually no, rather not. I'll enable that in circumstances on my own side. And then here we've got ACE sitting enabled by default. We'll leave it like that. The last thing we're going to add here is under systems, as part of logic entities, there are these things called virtual entities, and inside of that virtual entity there's a thing called a headless client. And essentially what this is this is a slot that allows the headless client to join the server and then, you know, do what it needs to do once it gets there. So what you'll do is you'll open up this headless client, you'll make him playable, and you'll change his variable name to HC1. Just make sure you keep it like that as a form of standardization. If we've got more than one headless client, it'll be named HC2, HC3, etc., as you need them. So HC1, make it playable, there you go. That covers essentially everything that you need to get your mission running on the server. So we have a respawn point, we have playable units, we have our headless, our sitting, and our headless client modules. We've got an enemy side, a couple enemy units, and that's it. That's all you need on top of this basic template to make a mission that'll work smoothly on our server. Just one thing before I forget, we should add the Zeus module as well if you wanna have access to Zeus in your mission. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna go to modules, find our Zeus, go to game master, add the module to the mission. Then under owner, we're gonna call this guy #admin logged, and what that does is whoever's logged in as admin at the time is gonna get the Zeus rights. So then we give Zeus a name, we'll call him Zeus1, boom, and then we're gonna select the default add-ons option to all add-ons including unofficial ones, and that should sort out our Zeus. Everything you need to access via Zeus will now be available. So essentially that covers everything for our mission making the safe way tutorial. I've showed you essentially everything that's part of the basic template that's available. I've explained the concept of respawns through description.ext, and we've added our headless, our sitting, and our headless client modules, and we've made all of our units playable so that you can indeed play them once you get onto the server. Thanks for watching, guys, and tune in for the next one. We'll cover loadouts in the more advanced sense as part of our next tutorial. I'll explain the concept of loadout core using this template, and how to make each of your units have different loadouts in different circumstances. Cool.